Alrighty, Rooney. Sorry about the delay, folks. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're going to keep reading from Acceptance by Jeff Vandermeer. Previously on, let's see, we started getting perspective segments from Control. He's not in Control anymore. Let's see. What else has relevant happened? Oh, yeah. The director had her fateful confrontation, one of her fateful confrontations, with Lowry. Lowry is, he's not quite all there. He's not what you'd refer to as a baseline sane human being. He's a little off, a tad aggressive. I just realized I still have the stream starting video on. There we go. This cover and all the other owl covers will make a lot more sense after this bit. After this week, it all comes together. Isn't that just terrific? I think so. I think so indeed. Okay. Oh yeah, the Whitby that came back might or might not be a doppeldip. Uh, that's hard to say. A doppel Whitby. There we go. Created by the Southern Reach. I mean, Area X. Southern Reach is the organization. You goober. Uh, let's see, what else happened? Now I gotta go flipping through. Not that I don't. Not that I think anyone's here at the moment. Really, it was the showdown with Lowry. That was the big one. Oh, right. Part of the showdown with Lowry has Jackie Severance. Severance. It's spelled like severance. I'm not sure if it's pronounced with a emphasis on the ants or not. So I kind of do both sometimes. So Jackie Severance is somehow involved and embroiled with Lowry. We do not know how. In fact, by the end of this book, I'm really not sure that we know how exactly. We just know that she is, which checks out basically. In the sense that we know that she worked at at the Southern Reach. We know she worked there from authority with her interactions with Control, but we don't really know how much of a reach she had. I'm kind of hoping that the eventual fourth book deals with some of that. Like, even if there's like no actual venturing into Area X weirdness, but is kind of like Authority again, where it's just like, here's weirdness by proxy sort of thing, dealing with kind of how was all this, how did all this come to be sort of thing. What were the power players there? I'd be cool with that. All right. So without further ado, if my metrics are correct, someone has just tuned in. Welcome, someone who has just tuned in. We were just getting to the end of Frag Rambles for like a minute or two or 5 or 10 or 30 before starting the stream. You have not missed anything of value, I must say. So yeah. Oh, right. Control and Ghostbird, which is the name we're going with for Doppelbiologist. I'm calling them doppelgangers because it's kind of what they are, sort of. Area X created duplicate of the biologist have just gotten to what's the island's name? Fire Island? No, it's not Fire Island. I don't remember the name of the island. The island across the way from the lighthouse that has a burned down lighthouse on it. Whatever. And who should they find? But Grace Stevenson, assistant director of the Southern Reach. That's the big one. That book is sliding out of its cover on its own accord. Is it really on a plane like that? How? How is it sliding? Stop sliding. I will you to stop. It's not okay. I gotta catch it. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Let's get cracking. Keep cracking in your mind, by the way. Possibly the term Leviathan. Possibly chthonic. Or chthonic? I don't actually know how that's pronounced. 0010. Control. Control woke to a boot and a foot just 6 inches from where he lay on his side under some blankets. The black tread of the Army-issue boot was worn down in tired ridges like the map of a slope of hills. Dried mud and sand commingled there, and in the sporadic black studs meant to provide a better grip. A dragonfly wing had been broken along the axis of that tread, pulverized into rounded panes and an emerald glitter. Smudges of grass, a smear of seaweed that had dried on one side of the boot. The landscape struck him as evidence of a lack of care not reflected by the tidy stacking of provisions, the regular sweeping out of leaves and debris from the landing. Next to the boot, the pale brown sole of a muscular foot that seemed to belong to a different person, the toenails clipped, the big toe wrapped tight in fresh gauze with a hint of dried blood staining through. Both boot and foot belonged to Grace Stevenson. Above the rise of her foot, he could see she held the 3 weathered, torn pages he'd rescued from Whitby's report. In her army fatigues, including a short-sleeved shirt, Grace looked thinner, and gray had appeared at her temples. She looked as if she had endured a lot in a short time. A pistol lay in a holster by her side, along with a knapsack. He twisted onto his back, sat up, and shoved up against the wall, catty-corner to her, the window between them. The raucous birds that had briefly woken him at dawn were quiet now, probably out foraging or doing whatever birds did. Could it be as late as noon? Ghostbird lay curled up in a camo-patterned sleeping bag, had throughout the night made little jerking motions and sounds that reminded Control of his cat in the grip of some vision. "Why the hell did you go through my pockets?" Somehow the accusatory tone abandoned the words as he said them, relieved to find his dad's carving still in his jacket. She ignored him, leafing through Whitby's last words, lingering between a smile and a frown, intense but uncommitted. "This has not changed since the last time I saw it. It's even more full of shit now. Probably. Except back then the author was a crackpot. Singular. Now we're all fucking crackpots." Fuck? A quizzical look. What's wrong with fuck? Area X doesn't give a crap if I swear. She continued to read and reread the pages, shaking her head at certain parts, while Control stared, still feeling possessive. He was more attached to those pages than he'd thought, afraid she might just ball them up and chuck them out the window. "Can I have those back?" A weary amusement, something in her smile that told him he was transparent. "Not yet. Not just yet. Get some breakfast. Then file a formal report." She went back to reading again. Frustrated, he looked around the space. Compulsively tidy, as he'd thought on first glance. Lock-action rifles in a precise row against the far wall, next to her sleeping space, which was a mattress covered with a sheet and blanket she had tucked in tight. A creased wallet photo of her girlfriend, propped on a ledge, curling edges smoothed out. Cans of food lined up against the long side wall, and protein bars. Cups and bottles of drinking water that she must have gotten from a stream or well. Knives. A portable stove. Pots, pans, lugged all the way from the Southern Reach building or scavenged from the ambushed convoy on the shore. She had found on how much she had found on the island he wouldn't want to guess. Control was just about to get up and pick out a can when she spilled the pages on the floor between them, right on a spot damp from rainwater. Damn it! He scrambled forward on all fours to retrieve them. The muzzle of Grace's gun dug into the side of his head near his ear. He remained extremely still, looking across at where Ghostbird slept. "Are you real?" she asked, in a kind of rasp, as if her voice had gone gray along with her hair. Should he have divined something more profound from her boot, her bandaged toe? "Grace, She smacked him across the forehead with the muzzle, shoved the mouth of the gun harder into his skin, whispered in his ear, "Don't use my fucking name! Don't ever use my name! No names! It may still know names!" "What may know names?" Stifling the word Grace. "Shouldn't you already know?" Contemptuous. "Put the gun down." "No." "Can I sit up?" "No. Are you real?" "I don't know what that means," he said, as calmly as he could. Wondered if he could move fast enough to get out of the line of fire, push the gun from his temple before she blew his brains out. "I think you do. Tampered with, spoiled goods, hallucination, an apparition." "I'm as real as you," he said. But the secret fear behind that, the one he didn't want to voice, along with the thought that that he didn't know what Grace had endured since he'd last seen her, that he wasn't sure he knew her now, any more than he knew himself now. "What script are you running off of? Central or the L word?" The L word? Absurd thoughts. Lie? Lighthouse? Lesbian? Then realized she meant Lowry. "Neither. I cut off hypnotic suggestion. I freed myself." Not sure he believed that. "Should we run a test?" "Don't try it. I really mean it. Don't." "I wouldn't. I wouldn't," Grace said, as if he'd accused her of high crimes. "That's L's kink, but I know the signs by now. There's a pinched look you all get, a paleness, the hands curling into claws, his signature written all over you. Residual, just residual. Still, you admit it." "I admit I don't know why the living fuck you're holding a gun to my head!" he shouted. Had Ghostbird heard nothing, or was she pretending to sleep? And there, as if to call him a liar anyway, what Ghostbird called the brightness, curious, interested, questing. It rose now as a tightness in his chest, a spasm in his left thigh as he remained on all fours being interrogated by his assistant director. A pause, an increased pressure of the muzzle at his head. He flinched. Then the pressure was gone, along with her shadow. He looked over. Grace was back against the wall, gun still in her hand. He sat up, hands on his thighs, forced a deep breath in, out, and considered his options. It was the kind of field situation his mother would have called an either without the or. He could either find some way to smooth it over, or go for the rifles against the wall. Not a real choice. Not with Ghostbird out of action. Slowly, carefully, he picked his 3 Whitby pages off the floor, willed himself to move past the danger of the moment. Is that your usual welcome? Her face a kind of impassive mask now, daring him to challenge her. Sometimes it ends with me pulling the trigger. Control, I am not interested in bullshit. You don't have any idea what I've been through, what might be real, and what might not be real. He slumped against the wall, holding Whitby's pages against his chest. Was there something in the corner of his eye? There's nothing to this world, he said, but what our senses can tell us about it, and all I can do is the best I can based on that information, even though he didn't trust the world anymore. There was a time I would have shot first, before you even left the boat. Thank you? Putting as much punch into that as possible. A curt nod, like he was serious, and Grace shoved the gun back in its holster on her right side, away from him. I always have to be careful. He noted the tension in her upper arm, and heard the sharp click as she toyed with the clasp on the holster, opening it, closing it. Sure, he said. I see someone got your big toe. That kind of thing could make a person paranoid. She ignored that, said, When did you get here? 5 days ago. How long since the border shifted? Had Grace lost track of the days out here by herself? No more than 2 weeks. How did you get across? He told her, omitting any detail about where the door under the sea might lie, omitting, too, that Ghostbird had created it. Grace considered all of that for a long moment, nursing a bitter smile that rejected interpretation. But he was on high alert again. She'd taken out her gutting knife with her left hand and was creating circles in the dust beside her. This wasn't just a paranoid debriefing. There were higher stakes and his own analysis to undertake. Had Grace just been rattled by something here on the island, or suffered the kind of shock that rearranged your thought processes, forever impaired your judgment? With as much gentleness as he could muster, do you mind if I wake up Ghostbird now? I gave her a sedative with her water last night. You what? Echoes of a dozen domestic terrorism interrogations, all the symbols and signs. Are you her new best friend now? Do you trust her? And do you even know what I mean? Trusted her not to be the enemy. Trusted her to be human. Wanted to say, I trust her as much as I trust myself, but that wouldn't satisfy Grace. Not this version of Grace. What has happened here? He felt betrayed, sad. To have come so far, but that old dynamic, sharing a smoke in the courtyard of the Southern Reach, had turned to ash. A shudder passed through Grace, some hidden stressor coming to the surface, moving through and past, as if waking only now from a nightmare. It takes getting used to, she said, staring down at the patterns she'd made in the dust. It takes getting used to, knowing that everything we did meant nothing, that Central abandoned us, that our new director abandoned us. I tried to stay. You told me to go. But that clearly wasn't how she saw it. And now they were at the very edge of the world, and she was taking it out on him. I tried to blame you at first, when I was getting things straight in my head. I did blame you. But what could you have done? Nothing. Central probably programmed you to do what they wanted. Going over those horrific moments again, jammed together in his memory, wedged in there at odd angles. The look on Grace's face in that moment of extremes, as the border advanced on the Southern Reach, weighing the possibility that he'd said nothing to her at all. Hadn't been as close to her and hadn't put his hand on her arm. Just thought he had. Your face control. If you could only, your face control. If you could have seen the expression on your face, she said, as if they were talking about his reaction to a surprise party. The wall of the building becoming flesh. The director returned in a wave of green light. The weight of that. The fingers of his left hand had curled around the carving of Chori in his jacket pocket. He released his grip, pulled his hand out, let his fingers open up, examined the white, curved indentations fringed with pink. What happened to the people in the science division? They decided to barricade the basement. But that place was changing very fast. I didn't stay long. Said so casually, too casually, talking about the disappearance of the world they had both known. I didn't stay long. One sentence disguising a multitude of horrors. Control doubted the staff had had a choice about what happened to them, sealed off by that sudden wall. And Whitby? But, remembering the last transmission from his spy cameras, he didn't want to know about the W word yet, or perhaps ever. What about the director? That level gaze, even in this new context, even with her on edge, twitchy, tired, and underfed. That unbreakable ability to take responsibility for anything and everything, and to keep pressing forward. I put a bullet in its head, as per orders, once I determined that what had returned was an intruder, a copy, a fake. She could not continue, or had thought of something that had distracted her from the narrative, or was just trying to hold it together. What it had cost her to kill even a version of the person she had been so devoted to could be said to have loved. Control couldn't guess. After a while, he asked the inevitable question. And what then? A shrug as she stared at the ground. I did what I had to. I scavenged what I could, took along those who were willing, and, per orders, I headed for the lighthouse. I went where she said. I did exactly what she said, and we accomplished nothing. We made no difference. So she was wrong, just wrong, and she had no plan. No plan at all. Raw hurt, and intensity to all of it. Everything she had told him in such a calm voice. He focused on the bottom of her boot. The disembodied thorax of a velvet ant lay somewhere south of 5 o'clock. Is that why you didn't go back across the border? He asked. Because of the guilt? There is no way back across the border, she shouting it at him. There is no door anymore. Choking on seawater, buffeted by fish. A vision of drowning all over again. No door. Not anymore. Just whatever lay at the bottom of the sea. Maybe. Lost in the thought of that, while Grace continued to talk about grotesque and impossible things. From the windows of the landing of the ruined lighthouse, the world looked different, and not just because Grace had re-entered it. A thin wall of fog had crept in from the sea to obscure the view, and the temperature had plummeted. They would need a fire by nightfall if that didn't change. Vague through both fog and tree cover, the ghost-like remains of houses, walls like warped slabs of flesh sagging into other, even more rotted flesh. Running parallel to the sea, a road, then hills covered in a dense pine and oak forest. There was no door in the border, leading home. Grace had terminated the director's doppelganger. Grace had felt the border move through and past her. It was like being seen, being naked, being reduced down to nothing. As she stared with a fierce devotion at the fragile photo, so carefully repaired, of the woman she loved back in the world. She had retreated in good order with a number of Southern Reach personnel, security and otherwise, to the lighthouse, per the director's prior directive, an order unknown to him and somehow reaching out of the past to be given validity. At the lighthouse, some of the soldiers had begun to change and could not handle that change. Some had struck out for the tunnel and never been seen again. A few had spoken of vast shadows approaching from the seaward side. A schism between factions, including an argument with the border commander, had made their position worse. None of them survived, I don't think. None of them knew how to survive. But she remained vague about her actions in the lighthouse, her retreat to the island. I did what I had to do. That's all in the past. I have made my peace with it. I don't sleep much. All of that a jumbled mess. In the past? It had just happened. He had held on to some hope or delusion of last redoubts, of hardened siege mentality, of making common cause to fight the enemy. But that had been a sick fantasy, a kind of abject denial. The Southern Reach was done, even if they hunkered down in the science division for the next century, became the subterranean seeds for pale, cave-dwelling people who lived in fear and whose children's children heard cautionary tales of the fucked-up surface world waiting for them above. You had expedition training? A guess, but an educated one, based on her supplies. The basic protection package, we called it, Grace said. The director came up with it for department heads, management. Because she'd valued their safety so much, had hoped the head of their props department would survive the apocalypse. He was willing to bet the basic protection package had applied only to Cynthia and Grace. She'd never shared it with him. If you planned for this, that means there's a mission? Does it look like there's a mission? A terse, ironic grin. Her tone of voice different, as if aware of Ghostbird, who had begun to stir, might be listening. The mission is survival, John. The mission is to take it day by day. I keep to myself. I follow certain protocols. I am careful and quiet. Grace was prepared to live out her days here. She had already resigned herself to that paradigm. Ghostbird propped herself up on one arm. She didn't look groggy. Her stare seemed like a weapon, as if she had no need of a gun or knife. Ghostbird didn't look like someone who would appreciate being told she had been drugged, so Control didn't. A respectful, fearful look Grace gave her, now that she wasn't a sleeping lump on the floor. What attacked the convoy? Ghostbird asked. No good morning, or even an interest in what they'd been discussing. How much had she overheard lying there? What had seeped into her half-conscious mind about fakes and the director's doppelganger? A grim chuckle from Grace, followed by a shrug, but no other answer. Ghostbird shrugged, fell upon a protein bar, gutted it with her knife, wolfed down the contents. Between bites, "This is horrible and stale. Have you encountered anything unusual on the island?" "It's all unusual here," Grace said with a kind of exhaustion, as if the question had been asked too often before. "Have you seen the biologist?" Direct speaking to direct, and Control tense, waiting for that answer. "Have I seen the biologist?" Turning that question over and over, examining it from all angles. "Have I seen the biologist?" Grace's clicking of the holster strap came quicker now, the pattern in the dust drawn at knife point more complex. Was that a helix? Was that two intertwining spirals? A starfish or just a star? Well, answer me, Grace, Ghostbird said, rising now, standing in front of them with her hands at her sides, in the kind of relaxed yet perfectly balanced stance someone took if they expected trouble. If they'd had combat training. The light through the light through the landing window faded into shadow as a cloud crossed over. A bird outside was muttering or whispering in time to the circling of the knife blade. Far distant came the suggestion of something sonorous, mournful, perhaps an echo off the lighthouse stones. A gecko scuttled up the wall. Control didn't know if he should be worried about the foreground or something in the background. This was the only question that mattered to Ghostbird, and Control didn't know what she would do if Grace wouldn't answer. Grace stared over at Control, said, "If I sat here and told this copy," pointing at Ghostbird, "everything I've found, we would still be sitting here when hell froze over." "Just answer the question," Ghostbird muttered. "Are we just passing through?" Control asked. "Should we be moving on?" That's what this came down to, in a way. Not Ghostbird's question, but Grace's attitude, the constant suspicion that wore on him. "Do you know how long I've been on this island? Did you ever ask me that?" "Have you seen the biologist?" Ghostbird demanded in a kind of staccato growl. "Ask me." The knife stabbed, vibrating into the wooden floor of the landing. The hand on the holster had gone still, resting on the gun. Control gave Ghostbird a quick look. Had he misread something vital? "How long have you been on the island?" he asked. 3 years. I've been here 3 years. Thanks for tuning in, Warren Steele. Sorry I didn't see your message until now. Outside, all seemed still, so impossibly still. The gecko frozen on the wall. Control frozen in his thoughts. Satisfaction that Grace could not quite suppress etched into her worn face. To have told them something they couldn't have known, couldn't have seen coming. 3 years, Control said, a plea for her to recant. "I don't believe you," Ghostbird said. A generous laugh. "I don't blame you much. I don't blame you at all. You're right. I must just be some crazy bitch who went mad out here all on her own. I must be unable to cope with my situation. I must be fucking nuts. Sure, must be. Except for this." Grace pulled a sheaf of pages out of her knapsack. Brittle, yellowing, they had handwriting on them. A rusting clasp in the corner. She flung the pages at Ghostbird's feet. "Read it. Read it before I waste my time telling you anything else. Just read it." Ghostbird picked it up, looked at the first page in confusion. "What is it?" Control asked, some part of him not wanting to know, not wanting another dislocation. "The biologist's last will and testament," Grace said. Part 2. Fixed Light. Writing, for me, is like trying to restart an engine that has rested for years, silent and rusting, in an empty lot, choked with water and dirt, infiltrated by ants and spiders and cockroaches. Vines and weeds vines and weeds shoved into it and sprouting out of it. A kind of coughing splutter, an eruption of leaves and dust, a voice that sounds a little like mine but is not the same as it was before. I use my actual voice rarely enough. A great deal of time has passed since I placed words on paper. For so long I felt no urge to do so again. I have felt more acutely than ever that here on the island I should never be taken out of the moment. To be taken out of the moment is dangerous. That is when things sneak their way in, and then there is no present moment to return to. Only very recently have I begun to feel something like a lack, or anything beyond the thought that I would, in this place, simply exist and live out whatever span was allotted to me. Neither have I had any interest in recounting, in setting down, in communicating, in what has come to seem such a mundane way. Perhaps it's no surprise, then, that I have started to write this several times, and that I abandoned 3 or 4 drafts of this document, this letter, this whatever this is. Perhaps, too, hesitance overtakes me, because when I think of writing I glimpse the world I left behind. The world beyond, that when my thoughts drift toward it, that when the world beyond, that when my thoughts drift toward it at all, is a hazy, indistinct sphere radiating a weak light, riddled through with discordant voices and images that cut across eyes and minds like a razor blade, and none of us able to even blink. It seems a myth, a kind of mythic tragedy, a lie, that I once lived there, or that anyone lives there still. Some day the fish and the falcon, the fox and the owl, will tell tales, in their way, of this disembodied globe of light and what it contained, all the poison and all the grief that leaked out of it. If human language meant anything, I might even recount it to the waves or to the sky, but what's the point? Still, having decided to finally let the brightness take me, after holding out against it for so many years, I am giving it one more try. Who will read this? I don't know, nor do I really care. Perhaps I am just writing for myself, that some further record exist of this journey, even if I can only tell you the first part of a much longer story. But if someone does read it, know that I didn't live here waiting for rescue, hoping for a 13th expedition. If the world beyond appears to have abandoned the entire idea of expeditions, perhaps that's evidence of the sudden appearance of sanity. But the world beyond, or even the dangers of this one I live in, will be even less of a concern in a few days. 01. The Brightness. At first there was always the island ahead of me, somewhere along the coast, and my husband's presence in the breadcrumb. Give me a minute. All right. Sorry about. Oh no. Oh, it's because I have the intermission thing on. Hello. Cool. Okay, sorry about that. That's that's something that I'm glad I got out of the way, but I kind of wish it could have waited 2 hours. Slurp. All right. Okay, where were we? It was actually an important call though, so it did have to be dealt with. Alrighty. Oh, we were basically right at the beginning of the chapter. It's fine. Click clack. I think. Yes. Yeah, close enough. All right. So sorry about all that. There were a couple of those back when I was doing what was it called? Snow Crash. There were a couple pretty significant interruptions. Some of them were cat related. Those are not so much a problem anymore, sadly. 01. The Brightness. At first, there was always the island ahead of me, somewhere along the coast, and my husband's presence in the breadcrumb notes I thought I found along the way, that I hoped came from him. Under rocks, stabbed on branches, curling dead on the ground. They were all important to me, no matter which might be real and which nothing more than chance or coincidence. Making it to the island meant something to me then. I was still holding on to the idea of causality, of purpose, as that word might be recognizable to the southern reach. But what if you discover that the price of purpose is to render invisible so many other things? According to his journal, it took my husband 6 days to reach the island the first time. It took me somewhat longer, because the rules had changed, because the ground I found purchase on one day became the next uncertain. That's a really hard sentence to read aloud. Jeez. It's because I don't have like a lot of formal poetry reading aloud training. That probably would help. Because the ground I found purchase on one day became the next uncertain, and at times seemed to fall away beneath me. Behind me at the lighthouse, a luminescence was growing in strength, and a burnt haze had begun to dominate the sky, and through my binoculars, for more days than should have been possible, there came the suggestion of something enormous rising from the sea in a continuous slow-motion wave. Something I was not yet ready to see. Ahead, the birds that shot through the sky trailed blurs of color that resembled other versions of themselves, that might have been hallucinations. The air seemed malleable, or like it could be convinced or coerced. I felt stuck in between, forever traveling, never arriving, so that soon I wanted a place to pretend was base camp for a while. A place that might quell the constant frustration of feeling that I couldn't trust the landscape I traveled through, my only anchor the trail itself, which, although it became ever more overgrown and twisty, never faltered, never petered out into nothing. If it had led me to a cliff, would I have stood there, or would I have followed it over the edge? Or would that lack have been enough that I might have turned back and tried to find the door in the border? It's difficult to predict what I might have done. The trajectories of my thoughts were scattered on that journey, twisted this way and that, like the swallows in the clear blue sky that, banking and circling back for a split second, would then return to their previous course, their fleeting digression a simple hunt for a speck of insect protein. Nor do I know how much of these phenomena, these thoughts, I should attribute to the brightness within me. Some, but not all, based on everything that happened later, that is still happening. Just when I thought the brightness was one thing, it would become another. The fifth morning I rose from the grass and dirt and sand. The brightness had gathered to form a hushed second skin over me, that skin cracking from my opening eyes like the slightest, the briefest touch of an impossibly thin layer of ice. I could hear the fracturing of its melting as if it came from miles and years away. As the day progressed, the brightness manifested in my chest like a hot red stone that pulsed next to my heart. Unwelcome company. The scientist in me wanted to self-anesthetize and operate, remove the obstruction, even though I wasn't a surgeon and the brightness no tumor. I remember thinking that I might be talking to the animals by the next morning. I might be rolling in the dirt, laughing hysterically under that merciless blue sky. Or I might find the brightness rising curious out of the top of my head, like a periscope, independent and lively, with nothing left beneath it but a husk. By dusk of that day, having ignored the biting flies and the huge reptiles that stared from the water, grinning up at me like the mindless carnivores they were, by then the brightness had come up to my head and lay behind all of my thoughts like a cooling piece of coal covered in icy ash. And I no longer could be sure that the brightness was a feeling, an impulse, an infection. Was I headed toward an island that might or might not give me answers because I meant to go there, or because I was being directed somewhere by an invisible stranger? A companion? Was the brightness more separate than I knew? And why did the psychologist's words appear in my mind so often, and why could I not pry them out? These were not speculative questions, a matter for idle debate, but concrete worries. At times I felt as if those words, my final conversation with a psychologist, lay like a shield or wall between me and aspects of the brightness, that an intended peculiarity of those words had activated something in me. But no matter how I turned that exchange over and over in my thoughts, I came no closer to a conclusion. Some things you can be so close to that you never grasp their true nature. That night I made camp, started a fire, because I didn't care who saw me. If the brightness existed separate, and if every part of Area X saw me anyway, what did it matter? A kind of giddy recklessness was coming back to me again, and I welcomed it. The lighthouse had long since faded, but I found I looked for it still, that great anchor, that great trap. Here, too, grew the purple thistles, in a greater abundance, which I could not help thinking of as spies for Area X, even if everything here spied and was spied upon. The wind came up strong from the shore, I remember, and it was cold. I held on to such details back then as a way of warding off the brightness, as superstitious as anyone else. Soon, too, a moaning came out of and through the dusk, along with a familiar thrashing, as something ponderous fought against the reeds. I shuddered, but I also laughed, and said aloud, "It's just an old friend!" Not so old, and not really a friend. Hideous presence, simple beast. In that fearless moment, or maybe just in this one, I felt a deep affection for and kinship with it. I went out to meet it, my brightness muttering the whole way in a surly, almost petulant fashion. A monster? Yes, but after the monster that was the crawler, I embraced this simpler source of mystery. Zero 02. The Moaning Creature. I'll spare you the search for this creature I had once fled. It was absurd trying to bleh. Let's try that again. I'm sorry. I'll spare you the search for this creature I had once fled. It was absurd trying to differentiate wind-blown reeds from those rattled by some force more specific, of sloshing through the muck and mire without breaking an ankle or getting stuck. Eventually I came out into a kind of clearing, an island of dirt covered in anemic grass and bounded by yet more reeds. At the far end, something pale and grub-like and monstrous flailed and moaned, its limbs pummeling the reed floor, the speed I had witnessed in the past seemingly now unavailable to it. I realized soon enough that it was sleeping. The head was small compared to the body, but faced away from me, so all I could see was a thick, wrinkled neck morphing into the skull. I still had a chance to leave. I had every reason to leave. I felt shaky, the resolve that had made me veer off the main trail evaporating. But something in its obliviousness made me stay. I advanced, keeping my gun trained on the beast. This close, the moaning was deafening, the strange guttural tolling of a living cathedral bell. There was no way to be stealthy. The ground was strewn with dried reeds over the dirt and grass that crackled with my steps, and yet still it slept. I trained my flashlight on its bulk. The body had the consistency and form of a giant hog and a slug commingled, the pale skin mottled with mangy patches of light green moss. The arms and legs suggested the limbs of a pig, but with three thick fingers at their ends. Positioned along the midsection near what I supposed was the stomach were two more appendages, which resembled fleshy pseudopods. The creature used them to help lurch its bulk along, but they often writhed pathetically and beat at the ground as if not entirely under its control. I shone the flashlight on the creature's head, that small pink oval backed by the too thick neck. As the molting mask I'd found during my prior encounter suggested, it had the face of the psychologist from my husband's expedition. And this face in its slumber formed a mask of utter, uncomprehending anguish, the mouth open in a perpetual "oh" as it moaned out its distress, as its limbs gouged at the ground, as it made its wounded, halting progress in what amounted to circles. Its eyes had a white film over them that told me it was blind. I should have felt something. I should have been moved or disgusted by this encounter. Yet after my descent into the tower, my annihilation by the crawler, I felt nothing. No emotion at all, not even simple, common pity, despite this raw expression of trauma, some agony beyond comprehension. This beast should have been a dolphin with an uncanny eye, a wild boar that acted as if it were new to its body. And perhaps it was part of an intentional pattern that I just could not see those outlines. But it looked like a mistake, a misfire by an Area X that had assimilated so much so beautifully and so seamlessly, which made me wonder if my brightness was a harbinger of some form of this. To disappear into the coastline, into the anonymous reaches of the beach and the wind, or the marshes, did not really disturb me, perhaps never had. But this did, this blind, relentless questing. Had I tricked myself into believing that letting the brightness overtake me would be a painless, even beautiful process? There was nothing beautiful about the moaning creature, nothing that didn't seem a ghastly intervention. In that context, I could not intervene, either, even as I watched the writhing of its perpetual distress. I would not end its misery, in part because I worked from incomplete data. I could not be sure of what it represented, or what it was going through. Beneath what seemed to be pain might lie ecstasy, what remained of the human dreaming, and in that dream comfort. There also came to me the thought that perhaps what this expedition member had brought to Area X had contributed to this final state. This is what I can remember now, when memory begins to be interwoven with so many other considerations. In the end, I took a hair sample that proved as useless as any other, a consistency I suppose I should have admired, but did not, and went back to my sad little fire out in the middle of a nowhere that was everywhere. But this encounter did affect me in one way. I became resolved not to give in to the brightness, to give up my identity. Not yet. I could not come to terms with the possibility that one day I might put aside my vigilance and become the moaning creature in the reeds. Perhaps this was weakness. Perhaps this was just fear. 03. The Island. Soon enough, the island became a shadow or smudge on the seaward horizon, so I knew it was only a matter of days, even if I had trouble telling how much time was passing. The island that was as blank to me now as my husband had been upon his return. I knew nothing of what I might encounter there, and the reality of this sobered me, made me monitor the brightness more closely, fight it harder, as if, ridiculously, by the time I made it across, I had to be at my best, my most alert. For what? For a corpse I might find if I were lucky? For some memory of a life back in the world that we could now misremember as more placid and comfortable than it had been? I don't know the answer to those questions, except that an organism's primary directive is to continue to exist, to breathe and to eat and to shit and to sleep and to fuck, and to otherwise carry on with the joyous repetitions of its days. I secured my backpack, and I dove into the water. Anyone reading who likes stories about characters huddled around guttering fires with the wolves waiting just beyond will be disappointed to learn that I was not attacked by leviathans from the depths as I swam over to the island. That, although tired and cold, I easily set up living quarters in the ruined lighthouse waiting on the shore. That I found enough food there, over time, by catching fish and foraging for berries, digging up tubers that, while bland, were edible. I trapped small animals when I had to, planted my own garden using seeds from the fruit I found, fertilized it with homemade compost. At first, the lighthouse perplexed me more than anything on the island. It kept striking me as a mirror of the lighthouse on the coast, the way the light glanced off of it, and that seemed to me like some kind of obscure and potentially ruthless joke. It could be just another detail in a host of them that brought me no closer to answers about Area X. Or this confluence, this incomplete synonym, the top caved in and the landing I chose as my stronghold languishing under a trough of wet, dead leaves. It could be an unmistakable and massive indicator of some kind. I took my time, later, exploring the lighthouse and the buildings nearby, the abandoned town, with a systematic and scientific thoroughness, but I felt that my first reconnaissance should be broader, to scour the island for threats, for food and water sources, for any sign of other human life. Not wanting to hope, for I had found no evidence of recent occupation of the lighthouse, which seemed the most likely shelter because most of the other buildings were, even at first glance, dilapidated, had rotted with astonishing swiftness once Area X had imposed its will upon this place. There were also signs of pollution, of old scars, but faded so fast into the firmament that I could not gauge how long ago they had been inflicted, whether Area X was accelerating the erasure of their effects. This island is about 14 miles long, 6 broad, and 40 in circumference, containing what I would estimate as about 84 square miles or more. 84 square miles or more than 50,000 acres. The pine and oak forest comprises most of the interior, sprawling down toward the shore on the landward side, but the side facing the sea has been assaulted by storms, and there you will find mostly scrub and moss and gnarled bushes. Fresh spring water occurs more frequently than I had expected, from rivulets meandering down from the hills toward the shore. This probably explains the placement of the abandoned town, along with protection from storms blowing in from the sea. But I also found one faucet on the lighthouse grounds that, although spewing forth brown rust at first, eventually settled down to a trickle of something brackish but drinkable from some hidden aquifer. Farther afield, I found a rich ecosystem in which a wary rabbit population was held in check by raptors and island foxes, these latter the scrappy small sort that suggested an isolated initial breeding pair, or pairs, had adapted to the limited range and opportunities of their surroundings. The bird life was robust as well, from tree swallows and purple martins to vireos and wrens, woodpeckers and nighthawks, along with too many types of shore birds to catalogue. At dusk, the sound of avian life triumphant forms a mighty bursting chorus of voices, such a contrast with the silence of the marshes, whose own richness is more muted, almost watchful. I wandered the island for many days, both its perimeter and the interior, getting a feel for it and what it contained. As I recorded my observations, I cursed the Southern Reach for not providing us with a map, even if I also knew that I would have tested any map provided to me and wound up doing almost as much work. Not just because I distrusted the Southern Reach, but also because I distrusted Area X. Yet when I was done with this initial inspection, I could not say there was anything preternatural or unusual about the island itself. Other, perhaps, than the owl. 04. The Owl. Did I find my husband? In a way, if not in the form in which I had known him. On the far side of the island, in the late afternoon, after I had burst through nettles and scrub and sticker, lacerating long grasses, all of it overshadowed by close-knit copses of wind-gnarled black pines, burst through to a tranquil cove that cupped a white sand beach and shallows that extended a fair distance before the darkness of deep water took over. On the beach, a scattering of low-lying concrete pilings and rocks, all that remained of an abandoned pier from another age, created a perch for more than a dozen cormorants. A single stunted pine, the height of a person, stood defiant amid rocks and cormorants alike, blackened and almost bare of needles. On one outstretched branch, the unlikely silhouette of a common horned owl, with sharp tufted ears. Rust-brown face with white feathers at chin and throat, mottled gray and brown body. My loud approach should have alarmed it, but this owl just perched there, surrounded by the cormorants sunning themselves. An unnatural scene, to me, and it brought me up short. I thought at first the owl must be hurt, more so when I came closer and it still didn't move, unlike the whirling circle of cormorants that, complaining bitterly, flew away, a long low line over the water, exiled to rove, restless. Any other owl would have taken wing and disappeared back into the forest. But instead it remained glued to the ridged, scaly bark of the branch, staring out at the fading sun with enormous eyes. Even when I stood right beside the tree, awkward on the rocks, the owl did not fly, did not look over at me. Injured or dying, I thought again, but cautious, ready to retreat, because an owl can be a dangerous animal. This one was huge, 4 pounds at least, despite its hollow bones, light-weight feathers. But nothing I had done had yet provoked it, and so I stood there as the sun began to set, the owl beside me. I had studied owls early in my career and knew that neuroses were unknown among them as opposed to other, more intelligent bird species. Most owls are also beautiful, along with another quality that is hard to define but registers as calm in the observer. There was such a hush upon that beach, and one that didn't register with me as sinister. At dusk the owl turned its fierce yellow gaze upon me at last, and with the tip of its outstretched wing brushing against my face, the bird launched itself into the air in a smooth, silent arc that sent it off toward the forest behind me. Forever gone, or so I believed, with any of a number of reasons to account for its odd behavior. The lines between the eccentricities of wildlife and the awareness imposed by Area X are difficult to separate at times. I needed to seek shelter for the night, and I found on the far western edge of the beach a small circle of rocks, around the blackened ash of an old fire, above the high tide mark, set back almost into the beginning of the forest. I found, too, in the last glimmers of light, an old tent, faded by the sun, weathered and crumpled by storms. Someone had lived here for a time, and without daring to think who it might have been, I made camp there, started my own fire, cooked a rabbit I had killed earlier that afternoon. Then, tired, I fell asleep to the sound of the waves, under a soft and subdued canopy of stars. I woke only once during the night, and saw the owl perched opposite me across the fire, atop my backpack. It had brought me another rabbit. I dozed again, and it was gone when I woke. I stayed there 3 days, and I admit I did so because of the owl, and because the cove was near perfect. I could see spending my life there. But also because I wanted to know more about the person who had made the fire, lived in the tent. Even in disarray and so old, it was clearly a standard issue tent, although it carried no Southern Reach logo on it. A little ways into the forest behind the tent, I found an expedition issue sidearm, much like my own, in a rotting holster, amid wildflowers and sedge weeds and moss. I found the undershirt from an expedition uniform, and then the jacket and socks, strewn across that expanse as if given up willingly, even joyously, or as if some animal or person had thrown them there. I did not bother to gather them up, to try to recreate this exoskeleton of a person. I would not find a name, I knew that, and I did not find a letter either. I would never really know if it might have been my husband who had camped there, or some other person, even more anonymous to me. And yet there was the owl, always watching over me, always nearby. Always a little closer, a little tamer, but never completely tame. It would drop twigs at my feet, at random, more as if through some absent-mindedness than on purpose. It would bow at me, a typical owl behavior, then spend the next hours distant, almost sullen. Once or twice it would perch at close to my height, and I would approach as an experiment, only for the owl to hiss at me almost like a cat, and beat its wings and fluff out its feathers until I had retreated. Other times, on a branch high up, the owl would sway and bob, bob and sway, moving its body from side to side while gripping its perch in the same place. Then look down at me, stupidly. I moved on, following the shore, sometimes also shadowed by the cormorants. I did not expect the owl to join me, but I am unashamed to say I was glad when it did. By the end of the second week it ate from my hands at dusk, before going off to its nocturnal life. During the night I would hear its curious, hollow hooting, a sound many find mysterious or threatening. Oh, excuse me. A sound many find mysterious or threatening, but that I have always found playful or deeply irreverent. And the owl would reappear briefly towards dawn, once in a tangle of feathers as it plunged its head into the sand and ruffled out its plumage, giving itself a dry bath, and then picking at lice and other parasites. The thought crept into my head when I wasn't careful, and then I would banish it. Was this my husband in altered form? Did he recognize me, or was this owl simply responding to the presence of a human being? Unlike the uncanny presence of other animals, there was no such feeling here, no sense of it to me, at least. No sense of it to me, at least. But, I reasoned, perhaps I had become acclimated by then. Perhaps I reached a kind of balance with the brightness that normalized such indicators. When I came full circle, back to the ruined lighthouse, the owl stayed with me. He tried even less for my attention, but in the twilight would appear in the branches of a tree outside the lighthouse, and we would stand there together. Sometimes he would already be there by mid-afternoon, if I walked through the shade of the dark trees, and follow me, making great hoot-hoots to warn of my coming. But never earlier, as if he remembered that I hated as if he but never earlier, as if he remembered that I hated the unnatural in animals, as if he understood me. Besides, he had his own business, hunting. After a week, though, he roosted in the shattered upper spire of the lighthouse. The cormorants, too, reappeared there, or perhaps they were not the same cormorants, but I had not seen so many of the birds in that place before my explorations. During the day, the owl would sun himself up there before falling into a sleep that sometimes was accompanied by a low and nasal snore. During the night, I would fall asleep on the landing, and above me hear, so faint, the whisper as his wings caressed the air on his flight to the forest to seek prey. In those transitional moments, between day and night, when anything seemed possible, or I tricked myself into believing that this was true, I began to talk to the owl. Even though I dislike anthropomorphizing animals, it did not seem important to withhold this communication because the evidence of his eccentric behavior was self-evident. Either he understood or did not, but even if not, sound is more important to owls than to human beings. So I spoke to him, in case he was other than what he seemed, and as common courtesy, and as a way to help with the welling up of the brightness. Despite this, which might be foolishness, how could I ever truly recognize in him the one I'd sought, ever cross that divide? Yet there grew to be a useful symbiosis in our relationship. I continued to hunt for him, and he continued to hunt for me, although with a kind of sloppiness, as if unintentional, rabbits and squirrels falling from his perch down to mine. falling from Rabbits and squirrels falling from his perch down to mine. Sorry. In some ways, wordless on his end, and based on the most basic principles of friendship and survival, this arrangement worked better than anything back in the wider world. I had still seen no person on the island, but now I found more evidence of a prior presence. It was not what I'd expected. 05. The Seeker and Surveillance Bandits. Returned from my exploration, with the owl as my companion, I now slowly took the measure of my immediate surroundings. The lighthouse, the buildings around it, and the town beyond. The town, which must have been abandoned long before the creation of Area X, consisted of a main street and a few side streets that then faded into the impression of dirt roads, the tire ruts overgrown with weeds. All of it empty. I could be the ruler of this place by default, if I wanted to be. Main Street had become a kind of facade, having fallen to a disheveled army of vines and flowering trees and bushes and weeds and wildflowers. Squirrels and badgers, skunks and raccoons had taken over the remains, ospreys nesting on the ruins of rooftops. In the upper story of a house or former business, pigeons and starlings perched on gaping windows, the glass broken and fallen inside. It all had the rich scent of the reclaimed, of sweet blossoms and fresh grass in the summer, with the pungent underlying odor of animals marking their territory. It had also a hint of the unexpected for me, a kind of lingering shock to see these rough, rude memorials to the lives of human beings in a place I had thought largely free of them. Here and there I found more signs of expeditions that had reached the island and either gone back across the water or died here and been transformed here. An abandoned backpack with the usual map in it. A flashlight. A rifle scope. A water canteen. These were tantalizing remnants, indicators that I tried to read too much into, for reasons that revealed a weakness in me. It should have been enough it should have been enough to know that others had come here first, and that others had sought answers, whether they had found them or not. But there were sedimentary layers to this information, and some of the older materials, which I believed dated back to just before and right after the creation of Area X, interested me more. People had taken up residence here within that narrow spectrum, and those people went by the initials of S and SB, although I never once found a fragment that told me what these initials stood for. Nor could I recall, either back in the world or during our training for the expedition, ever hearing of such an organization. Not, of course, that the island had been given any thought or attention in that training. By then, any betrayal by the Southern Reach struck me as just more of the same. In lieu of any other evidence, I called them the Seeker and Surveillance Bandits. It suited what I knew about them from the scraps they'd left behind, and for a time it occupied my days to try to reconstruct their identity and their purpose on the island. The leavings of the S&SB, their detritus, took the form of damaged equipment that I identified as meant to record radio waves, to monitor infrared and other frequencies, along with more esoteric machines that defeated my attempts to decode their purpose. Along with such broken flotsam, I uncovered weathered, often unreadable, papers and photographs, and even a few recordings that croaked out incomprehensible too slow words as I plugged them into a failing generator that gave me only about 30 seconds of power at a time before cutting out. All of this I found inside the abandoned buildings on Main Street, remains protected by fallen-in supporting walls, or in basements where certain corners had escaped flooding. Burn marks existed in places where controlled fires had been started indoors. But I couldn't tell if the S&SB had started these fires, or if they had come later, during some desperate phase before everything had been assimilated by Area X. Looking at all of that ash, I realized that any attempt to reconstruct a sequence of events would be forever incomplete, because someone had wanted to hide something. I took what I found to the lighthouse and began to sort through it, such as it was, all under the watchful but unhelpful eye of the owl. Despite the oblique nature of what I had recovered, I began to piece together hints of purpose, suggestions of conspiracy. All of what I relate here is highly speculative, but, I think, supported by the fragile evidence available to me. The S&SB had begun their occupation of this island not with a mapping of the perimeter, but with a thorough investigation of the ruined lighthouse, which meant they had come here with a specific purpose. That investigation had been twinned to establishing a kind of link between the lighthouse on the island and the one on the mainland. There were references to something that might or might not have been transferred, suggesting that perhaps the lens of the lighthouse I knew so well had originally come from here. But in context, this might or might not seemed almost certain to exist separate from the lens itself, or could exist separate. Torn pages from a book on the history of famous lighthouses, the lineage of lens manufacture and shipping, helped me little. There also was debate as to whether they sought an object or a recordable phenomenon, which seemed to return to the idea of linking the two lighthouses. If a phenomenon, which seemed to return... Wow, okay. Let's skip back a line. If a phenomenon, then this linkage was important. If an object, then the linkage might not be important, and either the island or the lighthouse on the mainland would no longer be of interest. Further, the nature of these fragments was contradictory as to their organization and sophistication. Some S&SB members seemed to lack even a rudimentary understanding of science, and wasted my time with scrawlings about ghosts and hauntings and copied down passages from books about demonic possession. The listing of stages interested me only inasmuch as I could transfer it to the biological world of parasitic and symbiotic relationships. Others among them lay out under the stars at night, and recorded their dreams as if they were transmissions from beyond. As a kind of fiction, it enlivened my reading, but was otherwise worthless. Along with this ephemeral Let's try this again. It's that time of the reading, folks, where my lips, the tip of the tongue, my teeth start to betray me in some impossible to describe ephemeral way, the brightness rising within me. Along with this ephemeral superstition, I would also group the lesser scientific observations, which reflected the involvement of third or fourth-rate minds. Here it was not so much the accuracy of the observations, but the banality of the conclusions. Into this category fell extrapolations about prebiotic materials and spooky action at a distance, along with already debunked experiments from decades past. What stood out from what I tossed on the compost heap seemed to come from a different sort of intelligence entirely. This mind, or these minds, asked questions and did not seem interested in hasty answers, did not care if one question birthed 6 more, and if, in the end, none of those 6 questions led to anything concrete. There was a patience that seemed imposed, and not at all a part of the swirling quicksilver consciousness that surrounded it. If I understood the scraps correctly, my pathetic attempt at playing Oracle, this second type, not only kept tabs on people living on the mainland, but on certain of its own fellow S&SB members. It did not have only experimentation on its collective mind. Does the residue of a presence leave an identifiable trace? Although I could not be sure, I felt I had identified such a presence regardless, one that had infiltrated the SNSB late. A shift in command and control towards something more sophisticated, staring out at me from the pages I had found. In among this detritus, these feeble guesses, the word "found," handwritten, triumphant. Found what? But with so little data, even found, even the awareness of some more intelligent entity peering out from among the fragments led nowhere. Someone, somewhere, had additional information, but the elements, Area X, had so accelerated the decay of the documents that I could not glean much more, even though this was enough. Enough to suggest that there had been a kind of tampering with this coast before the creation of Area X, and my own experience to tell me that the Southern Reach had deliberately excised knowledge of the island from our expedition maps and briefings. These 2 data points, although more to do with absence than with positive confirmation, made me redouble my efforts looking for S&SB scraps amid the rubble. But I never found anything more than what I uncovered on my first thorough investigation. For what it's worth, spooky action at a distance is one of my favorite lines from this. What does that mean? What is spooky action at a distance? Who knows? I'll tell you who knows. What evil lurks in the hearts of men? Only the shadow knows. No, it's just the shadow knows. Take the line and mangle it. Way to go! Damn it! Friggin' love the shadow, man. Good times. Uh, '06. The Passage of Time and Pain. I never had a country, never had the choice. I was born into one. But over time, this island has become my country, and I need no other. I never thought to seek the way out, back into the world. As the years passed and no one else reached my island refuge, I began to wonder if the southern reach existed anymore, or if it had ever existed, that perhaps there had never been another world or an expedition, and I had suffered a delusion or trauma, a kind of memory loss. One day, perhaps, I would wake up and recall it all, some cataclysm that had left me the only person in this place, with just an owl to talk to. I survived storms that gusted in suddenly, and drought, and a nail through my foot when I wasn't careful. I survived being bitten by many things, including a poisonous spider and a snake. I learned to be I learned to become so attuned to my environment that after a time no animal, natural or unnatural, shied away at my presence, and for this reason I no longer hunted anything but fish unless forced to, relying more and more on vegetables and fruit. Although I thought I grew attuned to their messages as well. In the lengthening silence and solitude, Area X sometimes would reveal itself in unexpected ways. I began to perceive infinitesimal shifts in the sky, as if the pieces did not quite fit together, and to acquire from the habitat around me a sense of invisible things stitching through, phantoms that almost made me reconsider my antipathy for the S&SB's emphasis on the supernatural. Standing in a clearing one evening, as still as possible, I felt a kind of breath or thickness of molecules from behind that I could not identify, and I willed my heartbeat to slow so that for every one of mine the hearts of the tree frogs throating out their song might beat 20,000 times. Hoping to be so quiet that without turning I might hear or in some other way glimpse what regarded me. But to my relief it fled or withdrew into the ground a moment later. Once the sky broke open with rain in an unnatural way, and through the murk an odd light burned at the limits of my vision. I imagined it was the far-off lighthouse, that other expeditions had been sent in after me. But the longer I stared, the more the light appeared to be cracking open the darkness, through which I glimpsed for a moment dissipating shadows that could have been peculiar storm clouds, or the reverse quickening of some type of. Let's try that sentence again. But the longer I stared, the more the light appeared to be cracking open the darkness, through which I glimpsed for a moment dissipating shadows that could have been peculiar storm clouds or the reverse quickening of some type of vast organism. Such phenomena, experienced off and on these past 30 years, have also been accompanied by a changing of the night sky. On such nights, presaged by only by a kind of tremor in the brightness within me, there is never a moon. There is never a moon, and the stars above are unfamiliar. They are foreign, belonging to a cosmology I cannot identify. On such nights, I wish I had decided to become an astronomer. On at least 2 occasions I would define this change as more significant, as a kind of celestial cataclysm, accompanied by what might be earthquakes, and cracks or rifts appearing in the fabric of the night, soon closing, and with nothing but a greater darkness seen shining through. Somewhere out in the world or the universe, something must be happening to create these moments of dysfunction. At least, this is my belief. There is a sense of the world around me strengthened or thickened, the weight and waft of reality more focused or determined. As if the all-too-human dolphin eye I once glimpsed staring up at me is with each new phase further subsumed in the flesh that surrounds it. Beyond these observations, I have a single question. What is the nature of my delusion? Am I hallucinating when I see the night sky that I know? Or when I see the one that is strange? Which stars should I trust and navigate by? I stand in the ruined lighthouse some nights and look out to sea and realize that in this form, this body, I will never know. My survival has also, to put it bluntly, been predicated by hurting myself. By the time I stood on the shore opposite the island, about to swim over, I was using pain to push the brightness back. The ways were myriad, and I was precise. You can find methods to almost drown, to almost suffocate, that are not as onerous as the thought might suggest. Ways to suggest the infliction of pain that can fool whatever lies within you. A rusty nail. A snake's venom. As a result, pain does not much bother me any more. It gives me evidence of my ongoing existence, has saved me from those times when, otherwise, I might have stared so long at wind and rain and sea as to become nothing, to just disappear. In a separate document, I have listed the best, least intrusive approaches, which I realize may seem morbid, even though I consider it an absurd method of chronicling my days. I have also noted the rotation of cycles that has proven most effective. Although, given the choice, I would not recommend this approach. You become acclimated to it, like doing the chores or foraging for food. After so much time, pain has become such a familiar and revisited friend that I wonder if I will notice him more now that I have stopped my regimen. Will an absence of pain be harder to get used to? I suspect that this concern will be forgotten amid so many other adjustments that must be made. For, having found so many ways to put it off, I believe that my transformation will be more radical than it might have been, that I might indeed become something like that moaning creature. Will I see the real stars, then? Sometimes, too, pain comes at you unexpectedly. You don't have to generate it, don't have to will it consciously upon yourself. It's just there. The owl that has been my companion these 30 years died a week ago, without my being able to help, without knowing until too late. He had become an old owl, and although his eyes were still enormous and bright, his colors had faded, his camouflage tattered. He slept more and did not go out to hunt as often. I fed him mice by hand in his redoubt at the top of the ruined lighthouse. I found him in the forest after he had been missing for a few days, and I had finally gone out to search for him. From what I can reconstruct, he had become injured, perhaps from frailty or the onset of blindness, broken his wing, and settled on the forest floor. A fox or a pair of foxes had probably gotten to him. He laid there, splayed out in a mottled flurry of brown and dark red, eyes shut, head fallen to the side, all the life having left him. My microscope had long since been abandoned in a corner of the lighthouse grounds, overtaken by mold, half buried there by the simple passage of years. I had no heart to take samples, to discover what I already knew. That, in the end, there was nothing a microscope could tell me about the owl that I had not learned from my many years of close interactions and observation. What am I to say? That I do not miss him? Part 3. Occulting Light. 0011. Excuse me. Ghost Bird. What kind of life was this, where you could read a letter from your own haunted twin? That you could live within the memories of another and think of them as real, a second skin, and yet so utterly false. This is who she had been. This is what she had thought, and how she had lived. Should that now be Ghost Bird's life, too? Her thoughts? Her thoughts? Anger and awe warred within, and no one to push either emotion onto except herself. She had to let them battle like a second heartbeat, and trust that her reaction was not just the mirror reflecting what it saw. That even if she was a mistake, she had become a viable mistake, a mutation, not an anomaly like the moaning creature. Long mouldering bones trapped in the marshes. There were questions she did not want to ask, because if she did, they would take on detail and weight and substance, flesh and skin reclothing the arch of the ribs. Wonders and horrors alike she could compartmentalize, but control, at least, might never be ready, and on some level it was wearying to push, to have that kind of purpose. It seemed to push against the reality of Area X, to say that even she had learned nothing from being her. Should she even try, knowing that it wasn't fair, that they had all traveled too far, too fast, even Grace with her 3-year head start? It was dusk now, almost nightfall, and into the silence and gathering shadows, Grace took the lead, said, "We're astronauts. All of the expedition members have been astronauts." That should have been comforting in its way, a kind of anchor, but Control's face had become a resolute mask that said he didn't want to deal with this, that, defiantly, he wanted only to bury his nose in what was comfortable. He clutched the yellowing pages of the biologist's letter tight in his left hand, while the biologist's journal, which Grace had rescued from the lighthouse, lay on his lap. It had interested Ghostbird to read it, to fill in the final gaps, and yet what gaps remained despite it? The white light at the bottom of the tower, the manifestation of the lighthouse keeper within the crawler. These were things she distrusted without seeing them for herself. But to Control, she knew it would just register as new evidence, new hope, information that might provide a solution, a sudden fix. As if Grace's scrutiny and thoughts about them were not enough. "We're not on Earth," Ghostbird said. "We cannot be on Earth. Not with that much distortion of time. Not with the things the biologists saw. Not if they wanted to pretend that there were rules in place, even if the rules had been obscured, made unclear, withheld. But was that true? Or had time just become irrational, inconsistent? Still, that reluctance, and the distance it created between her and them. Until Grace finally said, "That was my conclusion, one of the theories put forward by the science division." "A kind of wormhole," Control said. The limit of how far he could go. Anything more would be pulled out of him by the brightness. A disbelieving stare from Grace. "Do you think Area X builds spaceships too? Do you think Area X traverses interstellar space? Wormholes? Think of something more subtle, something peering through what we think of as reality. Flat, clipped words, stripped of the awe that should have animated them. Because she'd had those extra 3 years? Because she was thinking of loved ones back home? Control, so slowly, almost as if in a hypnotized state. Everything in Area X that we thought was degrading too rapidly, most of it was just getting old. Some things were very old indeed. The remnants of the village and the various sedimentary layers of those journals under the trap door in the lighthouse. So much more time had passed in Area X after the border came down, before the first expedition had gone in. People could have lived in Area X for much, much longer after the border came down than anyone had thought. How was this not known before? Control said. How was this not clear before? As if some elemental force of repetition might bring about a swift justice against those who had obstructed his access to the truth. Instead, repetition just underscored their ignorance. Corrupted data, Grace said. Skewed samples. Incomplete information. I don't know how she means, Ghostbird said, that so many expeditions came back disoriented, damaged, or not at all, that the SR had no reliable samples. She meant that the time dilation must be more severe when Area X shifted or underwent a change, and otherwise must be almost unmeasurable. She's right, Grace said. We never had anyone who lived long enough in Area X or saw so clearly and managed to write down their observations. Conflicting data, conflicting purposes. An opponent that didn't make it easy. But do we believe the biologist? Control asked. Because the theories of the biologist's copy might be suspect? Because he wasn't built for this and Ghostbird was? Do you believe me? Grace said. I've seen strange stars in the sky at night. I've seen strange stars in the sky at night, too. I have seen the rifts in the sky. I have lived here 3 years. Then tell me, how can the sun shine, the stars, the moon, if we are not on Earth? That's not the critical question, Ghostbird said. Not for organisms that are so masterful at camouflage. Then what is? Control frustrated, trying to take in the enormity of the idea, and Ghostbird found it painful to watch. The critical question, Grace said, is what is the purpose of this organism or organisms, and how do we survive? We know its purpose, Control said, which is to kill us, to transform us, to get rid of us. Isn't that what we try to avoid thinking about? What the director, you, pointing at Grace, and Cheney and all the rest of us had to keep suppressing? The thought that it just wants to kill us all. You think we didn't have these conversations 1,000 times? Grace said. You think we didn't go around and around trying to get out of our circles? People make patterns all the time without realizing it, Ghostbird said. An organism can have a purpose and yet also make patterns that have little to do with that purpose. So fucking what? Control snarled, a trapped animal. So fucking what? Ghostbird exchanged a stare with Grace, who looked away. Control wasn't prepared to receive this knowledge. It was eating him from the inside out. Maybe something specific would distract him. There's a lot of energy being generated and discharged, she said. If the border is a kind of membrane, it could be a case of dumping it somewhere else. Think of how things disappear when they come into contact with the border. But they don't disappear, do they? Grace said. I don't think so. I think they get sent somewhere. Where? Control asked. Ghostbird shrugged, thinking about the journey into Area X and the devastation and destruction she had seen. The ruined cities. Was that real? Something that gave them a clue? or just a delusion? Membranes and dimensions, limitless amounts of space, limitless amounts of energy, effortless manipulation of molecules, continual attempts to transform the human into the non-human, the ability to move an entire biosphere to another place. Right now, if the outside world existed, it would still be sending radio wave messages into space and monitoring radio wave frequencies to seek out other intelligent life in the universe. But Ghostbird didn't think those messages were being received. Another way people were bound by their own view of consciousness. What if an infection was a message, a brightness, a kind of symphony, as a defense, an odd form of communication? If so, the message had not been received, would probably never be received, the message buried in the transformation itself. Having to reach for such banal answers because of a lack of imagination, because human beings couldn't even put themselves in the mind of a cormorant, or an owl, or a whale, or a bumblebee. Did she want to ally herself to such a lack? And did she have a choice? From the window, the low buildings were revealed as facades, bruised and ruined cinder-block houses with the roofs gone, vines bursting out, and the worn white paint of the sides that lay in grainy despondency, unable to contain the tangled green. In among that unintended terrarium, a row of little crosses stuck in the soil, fresh enough to have been bodies buried by Grace. Perhaps she'd lied, and a handful of others had followed her over to the island, only to meet some fate Grace had avoided. She'd heard almost the entire conversation between Control and Grace, had been ready to intervene if Grace had not taken the gun from Control's head. No one could drug her if her body didn't want it done. She wasn't built like that. Not anymore. But she didn't like the view, felt some kind of instinctual discomfort at the sight of the damaged road, the scrapes on the forested hills that looked less like clearings in the late afternoon sun and more like a kind of violence. The seaward window looked out on calm seas and a mainland rendered normal and perhaps even ordinary. Yet the distance disguised the havoc wreaked on the convoy. Behind her, Grace and Control talked, but Ghostbird had disengaged. It was a circular discussion, a loop that Control was creating to trap himself inside of, to dig the trenches, the moat, that would keep things out. How is this possible? How is that possible? And why? Agonizing over both, what he knew or thought he knew, and what he could never, ever know. She knew where it would all lead, what it always led to in human beings. A decision about what to do. What are we going to do? Where do we go from here? How do we move forward? What is our mission now? As if purpose could solve everything, could take the outlines of what was missing and by sheer will invoke it, make it appear, bring it back to life. Let's try that sentence again. As if purpose could solve everything, could take the outlines of what was missing and by sheer will invoke it, make it appear, bring it back to life. Even the biologist had done it, creating a pattern out of what might be random, correlating eccentric owl behavior with her lost husband, when it might have been the evidence of, the residue of, some other ritual entirely, and thus her account of the owl no more on target than her assertions about the S&SB. You could know the what of something forever, and never discover the why. The allure of the island lay in its negation of why, both for the biologist and, Ghostbird guessed, for Grace, who had lived here with this knowledge for almost 3 years, as it ate at her. Ate at her still, the relief of companions having done nothing to take the edge off, Ghostbird observing her from the window and wondering if she still withheld some vital piece of information. That her watchfulness and the evidence that she didn't sleep well provided the outline of a different, undisclosed why. She felt so apart from them. She felt so apart from both of them in that moment, as if the knowledge of how far they might be from Earth, of how time passed, ruthless, had pushed them away, and she was looking at them from the border, peering in through the shimmering door. Control had started to return to safe ground. Control had started to return to safe ground of subjects like the lighthouse keeper, like Central. So there wouldn't be galaxies bursting in his brain like fireworks, and the Southern Reach became a redoubt of Area X, and humans turning into creatures with a purpose known only to the stitching in the sky, perhaps. Central kept the island a secret all this time. Central buried it, buried the island, just kept sending expeditions out here to this fucking ugly place, this place that isn't really even where it's supposed to be, this fucking place that just keeps killing people and doesn't fucking even give you the chance to fight back because it's always going to win anyway, and the Control couldn't stop. He wasn't going to stop. All he might do is pause, trail off, and then take it up again. So, after a time, Ghostbird stopped him. She knelt beside him, gently took the biologist's letter and journal from him. She placed her arms around Control and held him, while Grace looked elsewhere in embarrassment, or a suppression of her own need for comfort. He thrashed in Ghostbird's arms, resisting, her feeling the preternatural warmth of him, and then eventually he subsided, stopped fighting, held her loosely, then held her tightly while she said not a word, because to say anything, anything at all, would be to humiliate him, and she cared more about him than that. And it cost her nothing. When he was still, she disengaged, stood, directed her attention to Grace. There was still a question to ask. With no sound from the querulous nesting birds, or, indeed, much sound at all intruding beyond the waves and wind, their own breathing, and Grace rolling a can of beans back and forth with her foot. "Where is the biologist now?" Ghostbird asked. "Not important," Control said. "The least thing now. A fly or a bird or something. Or nothing. Dead?" Grace laughed at that, in a way Ghostbird didn't like. "Grace?" Not about to let her get out from under an answer. "Yes, she is definitely still alive." "And where is she?" "Somewhere out there." The sonorous sound now rising. The distant sense of weight and movement and bulk and substance and intent, and something in Ghostbird's mind linked to it, and no way to undo that. "Not somewhere out there," Ghostbird said. Grace nodding now, frightened now. This thing she couldn't tell them on top of all the impossible things she'd had to tell them. "The biologist is coming here." Coming back to where the owl had once roosted. Coming down to the place where her doppelganger now stood. That sound. Louder now. The snapping of tree branches. Of tree trunks. The biologist was coming down the hillside. In all her glory and monstrosity. And because I'm a champion, I came prepared. This is a image by doc.zinc that I was able to get a hold of. Much credit to doc.zinc for their depiction of the biologist. Ghostbird saw it from the landing window. How the biologist coalesced out of the night, her body flickering and stitching its way into existence, in the midst of a shimmering wave that imposed itself on the reality of forested hillside. The vast bulk seething down the hill through the forest with a crack and splinter, as trees fell to that gliding yet ponderous and muffled darkness, reduced to kindling by the muscle behind the emerald luminescence that glinted through the black. The smell that presaged the biologist, thick brine and oil and some sharp, crushed herb. The sound that it made, as if the wind and sea had been smashed together, and in the aftershock there reverberated that same sonorous moan. A seeking, a questing, a communication or communion. That Ghostbird recognized. That she understood. The hillside come alive and sliding down to the ruined lighthouse, at a steady pace like a lava flow. This intrusion. These darknesses that reformed into a mighty shape against the darkness of the night sky, lightened by the reflections of clouds and the greater shadow of the tree line and the forests. It bore down on the lighthouse, that strange weight, that leviathan, still somehow half here and half not, and Ghostbird just stood at the window waiting for it, while Grace and Control screamed at her to come away, to get away, but she would not come, would not let them pull her from the window, and stood there like the captain of a ship facing a monumental storm, the waves rising huge against the window. Grace and Control gone, running down the stairs, and then that great bulk was shoved up against the window and smashing into the doorway below in a crack and a crumble of stone and brick. Leaning against the lighthouse, and the lighthouse resisting, but only just. The song had grown so loud as to be almost unbearable. Now like deep cello strings, now like guttural clicking, now eerie and mournful. The great slope of its wideness was spread out before Ghostbird, the edges wavery, blurred, sliding off into some other place. The mountain that was the biologist came up almost to the window sill, so close that she could have jumped down onto what served as its back. The suggestion of a flat, broad head plunging directly into torso. The suggestion, far to the east, already overshooting the lighthouse, of a vast curve and curl of the mouth, and the flanks carved by dark ridges like a whale's, and the dried seaweed, the kelp that clung there, and the overwhelming ocean smell that came with it. The green and white stars of barnacles on its back, in the hundreds of miniature craters, of tidal pools from time spent motionless in deep water, time lost inside that enormous brain. The scars of conflict with other monsters, pale and dull against the biologist's skin. It had many, many glowing eyes that were also like flowers or sea anemones spread open. The blossoming of many eyes, normal, parietal, and simple, all across its body, a living constellation ripped from the night sky. Her eyes, Ghostbird's eyes, staring up at her in a vast and unblinking array. As it smashed into the lower floor, seeking something. As it sang and moaned and hollered. Ghostbird leaned out the window, reached out and pushed through the shimmering layer, so like breaking the surface of a tidal pool to touch what lay within. And her hands found purchase on that slick, thick skin, almost among all those eyes, her eyes, staring up at her. She buried both hands there, felt the touch of thick, tough lashes, felt the curved, smooth surfaces and the rough, craggy ones. All of those eyes. In the multiplicity of that regard, Ghostbird saw what they saw. She saw herself, standing there, looking down. She saw the biologist now existed across locations and landscapes, those other horizons gathering in a blurred and rising wave. There passed between the two something wordless but deep. She understood the biologist in that moment, in a way she had not before, despite their shared memories. She might be stranded on a planet far from home. She might be observing an incarnation of herself she could not quite comprehend. And yet, there was connection. There was recognition. Nothing monstrous existed here. Only beauty, only the glory of good design, of intricate planning, from the lungs that allowed this creature to live on land or at sea, to the huge gill slits hinted at along the sides, shut tightly now, but which would open to breathe deeply of sea water when the biologist once again headed for the ocean. All of those eyes, all of those temporary tidal pools, the pockmarks and the ridges, the thick, sturdy quality of the skin. An animal, an organism that had never existed before or that might belong to an alien ecology, that could transition not just from land to water, but from one remote place to another, with no need for a door in a border, staring up at her with her own eyes. Seeing her. Y'all didn't know this was going to turn into a book about kaiju, now did y'all? Well, it done did. Surprise! 0012, The Lighthouse Keeper. Repainted black day marks, seaward side. Ladder may need to be replaced. Rickety. Tended to the garden most of the day. Ran errands. Went on a hike late in the day. Sighted a muskrat, possum, raccoons, red foxes up a tree at dusk, resting in crooks like crooks. Downy woodpecker, red-headed woodpecker. 1,000 lighthouses burned to columns of ash along the coastline of an endless island. 1,000 blackened candles trailing white smoke from atop the broad, broken head of a monster rising from the sea. 1,000 dark cormorants, wings awash in crimson flames, taking flight from the waves, eyes reflecting the wrath of their own extinction. Who maketh his angels spirits, his ministers a flaming fire. Saul woke, coughing in the darkness, sweating from a thin, flat heat that flared up in wings across the bridge of his nose and over his eyes. Leaning forward through his skull to kiss that heat now came the now familiar pressure, which he'd described to the doctor in Bleekersville a couple of days ago as dull but intense, somehow like a second skin on the inside. That sounded bizarre, wasn't accurate, but he couldn't find the right words. The doctor had looked at him for a moment, almost as if Saul had said something offensive, and then diagnosed his condition as an atypical cold with sinus infection. Sent him on his way with a useless medicine to clear up your sinus cavity. His word was in mine heart as a burning fire shut up in my bones. There came a whispering again, and instinctually he reached a hand out to find his lover's shoulder, chest, but gripped only the sheets. Charlie wasn't there, wouldn't be back from his night gig for another week at the earliest. Unable to tell him the truth, that he didn't feel right, not a sickness in the normal way, not what the doctor had diagnosed, but something inside, waiting for its moment. A paranoid thought, Saul knew. It was a cold, or maybe a sinus infection, like the doctor had said. A winter cold, like he'd had in the past, just with night sweats, nightmares, and verse spilling out of him. This strange sermon that spiraled up into his thoughts when he wasn't vigilant, was coiled there now. And the hand of the sinner shall rejoice, for there is no sin in shadow or in light that the seeds of the dead cannot forgive. He sat up abruptly in bed, stifled another cough. Someone was in his lighthouse. More than one person. Whispering. Or maybe even shouting. The sound, by the time it infiltrated the brick and stone, the wood and steel, brought to him through a distance, a time that he couldn't know. The irrational thought that he was hearing the ghosts of dozens of lighthouse keepers all at once, in a kind of threnody, the condensed chorus of a century. Another phantom sound? The whispering, the mumbling, continued in a matter-of-fact way, without emotion, and this convinced him to investigate. He roused himself from bed, put on jeans and a sweater, and taking up the axe on the wall, a monstrous and unwieldy pendulum, he padded up the stairs in his bare feet. The steps were cold and the spiral dark, but he didn't want to risk turning on the lights in case a real intruder waited above. At the landing, the moon shone in at an angle, making the chairs there, the table, look like angular creatures frozen by its glow. He paused, listening. The waves below, their soft hush, stitched through with the sudden chatter of bats, close and then gone, as their echolocation pushed them away from the lighthouse walls. There should have been a hum in the background, too, a kind of purr from above, but he could not hear it, which meant no light shot out across 20 miles to guide the ships. He continued up as fast as he could, fueled by an anger that cut through the haze of his sickness, wanted confrontation. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my grace is made perfect in weakness. When he barged into the lantern room, it was to the sight of the blue-black sky filled with stars, and to 3 figures, 2 standing, 1 bent over in front of the extinguished lens. All 3 holding tiny flashlights, the pinpricks of that illumination only intensifying his sense of their guilt, their complicity. But in what? All 3 were staring at him. He raised his axe in a threatening way and hit the switch, flooding the room with light. Suzanne and a woman he didn't know stood by the door to the railing, dressed all in black, with Henry on his knees in front of them, almost as if he'd been dealt a blow. Suzanne looked offended, as if he'd burst in on them in their own home. But the stranger hardly acknowledged his presence, stood there with arms crossed, oddly relaxed. Her hair was long and coiffed. She was dressed in an overcoat, dark slacks, and a long red scarf. Taller and older than Suzanne, she had a way of staring at him that made him concentrate on Henry instead. "What the hell are you doing here?" Their calm, faced by a man with an axe, baffled him, took some of the ire out of him, this delay between accusatory question and any response. Even Henry had composed himself, gone from a look of almost of fear to a thin smile. "Why don't you go back to sleep, Saul?" Henry said, unmoving. "Why don't you go back to bed and let us finish up? We won't be long now." Finish up with what? Henry's ritual humiliation? His usually perfect hair was mussed, his left eye twitching. Something had happened here right before Saul had burst in. The condescension hit Saul hard, turned bewilderment and concern back into anger. "The hell I will! You're trespassing! You broke in! You turned off the light! And who is this?" What was the woman to Suzanne and Henry? She did not seem to even belong to the same universe. He was more than sure that the bulge under her overcoat was a gun. But he wasn't going to get an answer. "We have a key, Saul," Henry said in a cloying tone, as if trying to soothe Saul. "We have a permit, Saul." Head turned a little to the side, appraising, quizzical, telling Saul that he was the unreasonable one, the one interrupting Henry in his important studies. "No, you broke in. he said, retreating to an even safer position, confined by Henry's inability to admit this basic fact, confused by the way the strange woman now regarded him with a kind of gunslinger's sang-froid. "You turned off the light, for Christ's sake, and your permit says nothing about sneaking around at night while I'm asleep, or bringing guests." Henry ignored all of that, got up, and, with a quick glance at the woman and Suzanne, came closer than Saul wanted. If Saul took even 2 steps back, he'd be stumbling down the stairwell. "Go back to sleep." An urgency there, a whispered quality to the words, almost as if Henry was pleading with him, as if he didn't want the woman or Suzanne to see the concern on his face. "You know, Saul," Suzanne said, "you really don't look well. You are sick and need to rest. You are sick and you want to put down that very heavy axe, this axe that just looks so heavy and hard to hold on to. And you want to put it down, this axe, and take a deep breath and relax and turn around and go back to sleep. Go to sleep." A sense of drifting, of sleepiness, began to overtake Saul. He panicked, took a step back, swung the axe over his head, and, as Henry brought his hands up to protect himself, buried the axe head in the floorboards. The impact reverberated through his hands, jamming one of his wrists. "Get out! Now! All of you!" Get out of the lighthouse. Get out of my head. In the darkness of that which is golden, the fruit shall split open to reveal the revelation of the fatal softness in the earth. Another long silence spread, and the stranger seemed to grow taller and straighter and somehow more serious, as if he had her full attention. Her coldness, her calm, scared the shit out of him. "We're studying something unique, Saul," Henry said finally, "so perhaps you can forgive our eagerness, our need to go the extra mile." "Just get the hell out!" Saul said, and wrenched the axe free, although it cost him. Held it high on the handle, because in such close quarters it would be no use to him otherwise. There was such a terror in him now that they wouldn't go, that he couldn't make them get the hell out. While still in his head 1,000 lighthouses burned. But Henry just shrugged, said, "Suit yourself." Staunch though he felt What? Staunch though he felt weak, to fill the silence they kept leaving like a trap. "You're done here. I'm calling the police if I ever see you here again." Curious, the words that came out of his mouth, that he meant them and yet was examining them already for their truth. "But it is going to be a beautiful morning," Suzanne said, the words hurled at him with a knife's blade of sarcasm. That is a very strangely phrased sentence. Henry almost contorted himself to avoid brushing against Saul as they passed by, as if Saul were made of the most delicate crystal. The woman gave him a mysterious smile as she turned into the spiral leading down, a smile full of teeth. Then they disappeared down the steps. Oh, shoot. Of course I'm getting a phone call right now. One sec.
Sorry about that. I'm Mr. Important today.
Crazy. And it's like right before the end. I should have just let it ring, but like I saw who it was from. I was like, ah, jeez, I probably have to take care of that. I'm glad I did, but it wasn't as important as I was afraid of. Then they disappeared down the steps. When he was sure they weren't coming back, Saul leaned over to switch on the lens. It would need some time to warm up, and then he would have to go through the checklist of tests to ensure Henry and his acolytes hadn't changed the direction of the main reflective surfaces within the lens. In the meantime, still holding the axe, he decided he would go downstairs to make sure the odd three hadn't lingered. When he reached the bottom, he found no sign of them. Opening the front door, he expected to see them walking across the lighthouse grounds or getting into a car. But even when he turned on the lawn lights, there was no sign of them or of a vehicle. Not enough time had passed. Had they run part of the way and disappeared into the hazy gloom of the beach? Or scattered into the pines, hidden in the marshes, become one with the shadows there? Then he heard the faint sound of a motorboat over the waves. A boat that must be running without lights. The only illumination now, besides the moon and stars, came from the faint red dots still pulsing from the island. Back at the front door, though, a shadow waited for him. Henry. "Don't worry, it's just me," Henry said. "The other two are gone." Saul sighed, leaned on his axe. "Will you never just leave, Henry? Will you continue to be such a burden?" But he was relieved Suzanne and the unknown woman hadn't remained behind. "A burden? I'm a kind of gift, Saul, because I understand. I know what's going on." "I've told you I don't know what you're talking about." "Saul, I made the hole in the lens while Suzanne was away. I'm the one." Saul almost laughed. "And that's why I should listen to you? Because you vandalized my lighthouse?" "I did it because I knew something must be in there. Because there was this one spot where none of my equipment registered anything."
So what?
Didn't that just mean that trying to find strange things with uncertain instruments was a losing game? "Saul, why would you look so haunted if this place wasn't haunted also? You know just as I know, even if no one else believes." Henry. Should he launch into an explanation of why faith in a god did not automatically mean a faith in spirits? "You don't need to say anything, but you know the truth, and I'll track it down too. I'll find it." The eagerness in Henry, the way he fairly thrummed with it, shocked Saul. It was as if Henry had thrown aside a disguise, laid bare his soul, and beneath that guarded exterior Saul had discovered one of the more virulently rigid of his flock from back north. The chosen ones who would never be dissuaded, the seance side of their little brigade. He didn't want a follower.
I still don't know what you're talking about.
Obstinate, because he didn't want to be dragged into this, because he felt so ill. Because a few strange dreams did not add up to what Henry wanted them to add up to. Henry ignored him, said, "Suzanne thinks the catalyst was something they brought with them. But that's not true, even if I can't tell you what combination of steps or processes brought us to this point. And yet it happened, after we've spent so many years of searching in so many places with so little to show for it." Against his better judgment, because more and more Henry looked like a victim to him, Saul said,
Do you need help? Tell me what's going on and maybe I can help you. Tell me who that woman was."
"Forget you saw her, Saul. You'll never see her again. She doesn't care about the supernatural world or getting to the truth. Not really." Then Henry smiled and walked away, toward what destination Saul had no idea. And we're going to call it at that for this week. And it looks like we are on track for 2 more installments because I've been able to do solid 50-page chunklets out of this sucker every time, which has been good. So yeah, should be set to wrap up on the 11th of August. So that's nice. And then starting, oh wait. So what I might do on the 18th, the following week, is short stories because I am gone the week of the 25th. I'll figure it out when I get there. There might be some crisis in between now and then, which will make everything work out smoothly. Um, I know, optimism, right? Such an optimist. Ah, you always look on the bright side. You're a glass half full kind of guy, isn't you? So half full. Half full of what? They never ask, do they? I'm a glass half full kind of guy. Never mind. The shadow knows. Anyway, so yeah, after my absence, the week of the 25th, we'll get cracking on the final volume of the Rifters trilogy by Peter Watts. So back to that punchy, edgy sci-fi, skiffy stuff that y'alls know and love. After that, and that's probably going to be another 6 installments or so. So after that, sometime in, I'm guessing November, or not November, October at this point, probably then I'll take a general break to do either like a couple weeks worth of short story pulp material or um, lost my train of thought, or possibly do Oceanic by Greg Egan, even though that's pretty long in and of itself. Where am I here? In space and time. Okay, July. There's July. This is the 28th. Okay, good. So that's 1, 2, blank week, blank week. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's October. And Oceanic is fairly beefy. That's going to take me a while to get through. If I do wind up doing that, that's going to be until 1, 2, 3, 4, call that 6 weeks. So yeah, definitely though, by the absolute end of the year, we will have started Hyperion. I promise. I promise we'll have started Hyperion by the end of the year. Sometime next year, I would like to, well, okay, at some time in the distant future, the unforeseeable future, misty in time though it is, I do want to get around to Endymion, which is the sequel to the Hyperion Cantos. But that's a ways down the road. That's at least a year from now, at least, probably more. So after Hyperion, there were other books that were requested, not the least of which is the Three-Body Problem by Xixin Liu. I doubt I'm pronouncing that name correctly, but bear with me. There was that. Somebody has requested Neuromancer, which is a great book, but kind of tricky to read. And there's another book that I'm completely forgetting that I can't remember. What is it? What is it? Damn it. Bugging me. Bugging me, bugging me, bugging me. Margot Lane. That feels like a name I should know. Margot Lane. Oh, that's a Shadow reference. That's why it's a familiar name. Okay, very good. Thank you. Excellent. I've got like it's not a large archive, but it's a small archive of old Shadow serial Serial TV, of a TV thing they did, as well as some of the audio radio broadcasts that had been recorded over the years. The less said about the 1994 movie, probably the better. It's not that great. Um, I blame Alec Baldwin. It's not his fault, maybe. It's probably his fault. Um, it's okay. It's okay. It's a cute movie. I watch it occasionally when I want to watch something fun, and or what have you. But I don't find it especially indicative of the source material. Anyway, um, let's see. Man, what was the? It was something someone had requested. What was it? Ah, this is bugging me. I guess if somebody has other requests other than Three Body Problem, and it was the sequel to something. It was the second book in a series, so I had to read the first. What was it? Oh! Well, I don't know what it was now. It doesn't matter. It does matter. It matters greatly. So if the person who requested the other thing and is hearing me very distinctly not mention its name, uh, please just post it in the comments. And that goes to anyone who has requests. Post them, and I'll find a way to work around and get to them. It'll happen eventually. In the fullness of time, provided no animals come and rip out my voice box, in which case I'll have to do it sounding like this the entire time, which is going to hurt. Um, I don't even know how that would transmit over a microphone, in truth. I don't even want to know. Probably someone has requested Armor by John Stakely. Surely someone has requested Armor by John Stakely at this point, though I would remember if somebody had. Um, so it's good. It's a military sci-fi romp in the vein of Starship Troopers with a lot less. What's the word I want to use here? Proselytizing isn't the right word. It's not proselytizing. Not really. It's a lot less political. I guess if you could call it political. Anyway, hopefully in the near future, our good friend Jeff Vandermeer will release the fourth Area X book, and hopefully in the near future, Peter Watts will release the third Blindopraxia novel. I would really like those to happen sometime in my lifetime before those authors bite the bullet or kick the bucket or whatever. It'd be nice, you know. Anyway, with that, I got to skip. Thanks again to everybody who tuned in, to anybody listening to this after the fact. I do this every week. Every Friday is Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. In this case, we're doing a read through of Acceptance, the third and now not so final volume of the Area X/Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer. I've got all the others recorded and up there. They should be in their proper playlists. I finally have the playlist for this one started, so that's good. Yeah, that's it. Stay safe, stay sane, stay toasty or cool, particularly cool if you're in the United States of America, because it's freaking hot here. At least there's a breeze right now, but it's just like, it's like 90 something degrees with distressing levels of humidity. It's not okay to be out in right now. Like, it's full on siesta time as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, Stay cool and be decent to each other. Sees y'all later.